All right, I'm going to go ahead and get going. You're in building a Drupal 8 site for CancerQuestorg, developer's perspective on Drupal 8. My name is, well, I'll get to that slide in a second. All these slides will be available online if you want any of the links that are in them. I take a little while to make sure that they're pointing to the right place, so they should be accurate for a while. Moving down the line. Now let's see if I can actually get the focus right. There we go. Who am I? My name's Dan Hansen. I've been a Drupal developer for almost 6 years, started with Drupal 6. I've gone to Drupal camps in North America since Denver? Does that sound right? Lead developer right now for Sevaa Group. We do hosting, we do managed services, we do development. We love Drupal. Drupal's a great open source product that we like to help people use to leverage all their content and get it on the internet. I also build a lot of Legos. In my free time, I do things like take pictures of myself as Batman. A little bit about CancerQuestorg. It is a cancer education resource for both cancer patients and cancer biology students. It's a pretty comprehensive site. If you are an oncology student, you can go there and learn from the basics of cell biology all the way up to cancer treatments and exactly how they're being used in the real world. Founded in 1998, operated by Dr. Greg Orloff. Excellent guy, fantastic client, very passionate about his work. He's got a great profile online where he describes how it was his wife's cancer that sort of brought him into making the site and making it so informative and well-researched. It's also under the purview of Emory's Winship Cancer Institute, so it's got the backing of a major cancer research center, which is always lovely if you're trying to get good, correct information. So if it's such a lovely site and it's got all this great information, why did it need an update? It was very mobile unfriendly. It was all table-based. I don't think the layout had been updated since 1998, which is probably not true, and I'll probably get yelled out for it later, but it's all very inflexible and needed to be made so that it could be legible on a cell phone or a tablet, whatever somebody was trying to access it on. It was built on a custom CMS style site builder called Perk. CMS is kind of a loose application of the term here. It had a CK editor, which was nice to write content, but what Perk actually did was take the site and take it from a database and turn it into static web pages. What that meant was it was a faster site, but it also was something that needed to be rebuilt and all these pages re-rendered every time there was a change to the site. The front end that actually built those pages and had some of the actual active content was ColdFusion. It had an Oracle database backend, which will be relevant later. It also had a bunch of Flash content, which if you're trying to build a mobile site, obviously you don't do that because Flash works in maybe a handful of places anymore, and it's getting smaller and smaller every day. And it had a data design. You can see it here. The Wayback Machine is really good about caching things that have really bad design for some reason. If it's built out of tables, the Wayback Machine is like, oh, I got this. So I was able to pull a pretty accurate screenshot for the Wayback Machine. You can actually hop in there and take a look at it if you want to. Before we get into migration, I actually want to take a quick look at the new site. And this site's live. You can hop in anytime. You can see, as I'm sure you've all got a flyer, it's all this lovely amount of information. The content is now available through a lovely mobile menu. You get information about cancer biology. You can dig deep into different parts of it, cell division, all the way up into information for patients. Things like treatment, cancer prevention, diagnosis, drug reference. That was a big, important part of what we did was make a very solid drug reference. Each one of these drugs has like a diagram and all this information. If you've worked with the back end of Drupal before, you could see how this would kind of break down into fields very easily, which was very nice for us moving forward. But that's just a generalized overview. I should note also that one of the big things we worked on for CancerQuest was multilingual, so all this content is also available in Spanish. And we're working on Chinese, traditional, and simplified. Yes?
How do you do that? Obviously, you're not rewriting everything in Spanish, right?
Oh no, everything is actually rewritten in Spanish. There's a very powerful translation module that I'll actually go over a little bit later on that is very handy in getting those translations, but everything is hand rewritten into Spanish so that it's accurate and presented correctly. We had the benefit, actually, of the original site actually being translated into most of those languages already. It was already in Spanish. There was some older content that was in a lot more languages like Russian, Chinese, Italian. I think they'd started on French. But his goal, Greg's goal, was to sort of make this available to everyone that he possibly could. The better information he could get to the most people, that was his ideal. All right, so get started on the process of what it took to actually move this site from the PERC database into migration, or into Drupal 8, sorry. Migration is great now because Migrate is in core Drupal 8. If you don't know why that's cool, just basically you could turn on a Drupal 8 site and bring in content from another site without much struggle at all. And it's integrated into different parts of core that are also very useful, but some of it's not quite in there. Specifically, migrate tools is what provides the drush commands. Drush being the command line operation system for Drupal. There's also Drupal console now that actually can do some of the migrations, but I haven't really gotten into console just yet. But you need to get the supplementary module, migrate tools for drush commands. Migrate Plus has your examples and also prepare row, which was a big deal in Drupal 7, but less so now. And I'll go over that a little bit. Sources are also totally separate, so if you needed a source for a CSV or a JSON file import, then that's going to be a whole separate module that you have to integrate into your system. Nothing direct. I was just talking about sources. There's no source right now for going directly from an Oracle database. That is not a terribly big surprise. Not a lot of people jump ship from Oracle and ColdFusion to PHP, MySQL, Drupal 8, all that good stuff. So what we ended up doing was having to export all the data into JSON. If you've ever worked with Oracle, it's got some great third-party tools, and it's got some horrible first-party tools. So we couldn't use the first-party tools to get the JSON data. We actually had to bounce to a third-party tool. Big ordeal, but it all got put out to JSON and taken care of.
Did you normalize the database, or did you just take the schema out of it?
It was actually pretty well normalized. Not a lot of repetition in the data, but we did what we could with what we had. I mean, most of it's textual data, so you're not going to see a lot of repetition, but I'm trying to think of a specific example. I think the drugs had to be normalized. We had to spread those out into different fields, particularly because of the multilingual aspect. But other than that, it was really just a pretty straight shot over. So we were able to take these JSON dumps and be like, oh, this one is going to be a content type. This one's going to be a taxonomy. Sorry. There's not a lot of documentation on migration right now. It's getting built up. There's a lot of people that are working on it. It's getting better and better. I will say that if you're working on migration, there is a focus on process plugins, which are probably the most useful part of it. It's what replaces prepare row. I think I might actually have this as a separate point on this slide, but we'll get there eventually. Anyways, to build a migration, if you don't already know, you build a YAML file, and then that gets updated as configuration in the system, and then you can just run it using Drupal console, or Drush rather. The configuration is much more straightforward than it was on Drupal 7. On Drupal 7, to migrate into Drupal 7, you had to write these massive plugins that had 4 or 5 different files in different places. It's really just build a config, make sure you have the plugins that you need, and you should be pretty much good to go. So the API has some very helpful documentation. What limited amount there is, there's a link to that there. And as I mentioned, process plugins. That's basically like the core of it. I had a specific process plugin in mind. You had mentioned some of the data coming out. You'd mentioned normalizing, and normalizing was not what we did, but we did actually have to take the data and refine it to get it out into proper JSON. Process plugin was invaluable for that. There's a lot of really rudimentary things that a process plugin does that once added together, and you can chain these together, which is the best part of it. Once you add those rudimentary functions together, you can get just about any output you want. Say, if you need a multi-value field where everything has to be capitalized, well, you can run a process plugin that will capitalize everything in the field, and then another process plugin that will combine all the fields or all the data into a single array so that you can have a multi-value field. Very excellent because of that chaining. Multilingual. This was another huge component of the site that we had to work with. Starting with, we just had the 2 languages, but obviously, like I said, looking to expand into things like Chinese. Incredibly easy to put new languages in. Really just update a setting on the back end and save that to config, and you're good to go. There are lots of caveats and gotchas, though. For example, there are 3 different places for translations on the site. If you've worked with Drupal in the past, that's not a huge deal, but when somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I need this content translated," and you have to be like, "Well, what kind of content is it? Is it an entity that needs to be translated? Is it a configuration that needs to be translated? Is it a user interface that needs to be translated?" That's really just a matter of training, but it's a terrible burden for anybody that's coming to Drupal fresh, and you have to be like, "Well, I mean, you can translate it, but you might have to go to about 6 different places to figure out what it is." Some modules are aware of changes to multilingual URLs, and some are not. This was an issue that we actually ran into on a core module even, but even contrib modules, important ones like redirect, where you could add 3-1 redirects, we had some issues there. Bulk node updates can be very risky, and what I mean by that is if you have a URL using path auto or some other URL generation on the back end of the site, if you go to bulk update all of those for one language and don't specify content that's only that language, you can get the wrong URLs generated for multilingual content. I broke most of the foreign language content on the site like twice doing that. So just be aware. And then translation management tool. This is actually something that's really neat that we came across in multilingual. TMGMT is what they call it. But it basically allows you to farm out these translations to just about anybody that you need to. Whether you want to do an automated version through Google or Bing, or if you want to send it to a translation service, there's integrations for that. Basically, people can content editors can go through the site and select what content they need translated, throw it in essentially a shopping cart, and then say, "Hey, send the shopping cart out to get translated," and then you can collect bids from different places that'll do the translation. You can get it automatically translated. Very excellent, very robust translation management tool. Highly recommend it if you are actually building a multilingual site and are having to outsource the translations at all. Flash and other media. As I said before, there was a lot of Flash content on the site, something we definitely needed to get rid of. All the video content got moved to YouTube. That was really just an effort that they had already started. Most of their video content was already there, but we were still using FLVs and Flash players on the site itself. So we just kind of came in and finished the job, made sure all the links got replaced, all the embed codes got swapped out. and made it so that it's very easy to sort of socially link all this video content as well. There are a lot of games on the site. We rebuilt those in JavaScript. There's an excellent flexible library implementation on Drupal. If you haven't tinkered with it yet, basically you can build a library using another YAML file, either in your theme or .library.yaml file in your module. And then you can reuse that library anywhere you want. It's a vast improvement over libraries, the libraries API that used to be a big part of Drupal 7. It's in core now. It's very handy and lets us reuse content all across the site. The game content, we actually had games that had a lot of the same functionality in them, but the backend content was different. So you would have a game about cancer metastasis, and you'd have a game on cell structure, but they'd be the same game, they would just have different answers. So our solution for that was to move it to block content. Block content is in core. It is essentially entities for blocks. And what that means is instead of having a block being a piece of configuration that you have to manage through that blocks page, it actually becomes an entity that you translate. There are other excellent components. There's a library for these block content pieces so that you don't, if you need a block and don't particularly have to use it right then and there, you don't have to make it and then disable it. You just have this lovely little backend library to hold on to this content. There's another component in this. And I was going to demonstrate some of these games real quick. Of course, I'm still on the Spanish site. All right, and I think there's a quick link here to games. So you can see this game is sort of a matching game where you just sort of put things in order and check to see if it actually was the right order, get more information if it's not. This is sort of an example of something that we put into block content. You know, there's probably 24 of these Know the Flow games across the entire site. All of the processes and the order that they go in actually sits in a block content entity on the back end so that we can translate it going from one to the other. So if you go to the Spanish translation, you can see that it's the same library reused, just with a different backend entity that has different translated content that you can put in place. So that's very lovely. Very excited about how block content is moving forward on Drupal 8. And it's probably one of the more useful tools that we came across. The media entity ecosystem. Who here has used media in Drupal 7? Okay, throw that away, because now it's apparently an entire ecosystem of media modules. It's now pretty well documented. There's new modules being added every day to this ecosystem, and those obviously are not fully documented, but some of the core ones like media entity, entity embed, things like that, are pretty well documented, if a little young, and I'll explain what I mean by that. There are lots of support modules to make this all work. I detailed some of them just now. Let's actually crack this open. So the media guide's actually on Git, but you can see this whole list of modules that falls into the ecosystem here. Some of the core ones are that entity embed, entity browser. That's what's actually going to let you put media within content on your site. Media entity is what allows you to take media files and turn them into entities, which is not that far off from where media was in Drupal 7, but just kind of got a new name, I guess. Big part of the media entity ecosystem is that it introduces the concept of entity browsers. You can use this beyond content in your site. You can use it to track down videos, PDFs, images, all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it didn't work for us. Some of these modules were just not refined all the way through. Some of them interfered with other modules on the site. It was just a little bit young, and also Greg, who was sort of the lead on the site, and his team couldn't really wrap their heads around how media worked differently from your traditional file system, particularly because that's sort of what they used on the back end of the perk system. So we fell back to IMCE, which if you've used that is pretty straightforward if you're used to file systems. Yeah.
What version of Drupal did you start with when you started off the site?
Started this site, we started 8.1.10, I think, is where we were right before launch. I don't think we've bumped up to 8.2 yet, but yeah, 8.1.10, we were still having most of the same issues that we were having before. So,
just to verify, I understood you right. You replaced the use of Entity browsers with IMCE?
We replaced basically the whole Entity ecosystem. And the biggest component of that was replaced by IMCE was the Entity Embed system. Entity Embed is kind of flaky, if only because it uses modals to get that entity in place. But I'll go over that a little bit more because I have a whole list of gripes at the end of this presentation.
Yeah, because we actually ran into a recent problem with that.
Yeah. Configuration management. If you aren't doing this already, start using file-based config management for development. It's super useful. If you've ever had to write a feature and push that through your entire development team, this is essentially close to a replacement. It's not a perfect replacement at all. But this is one of the best ways to get you guys' database on the same track using these config entities.
Now, question.
Sure.
When you took that site to production, did you leave the configuration management file-based, or did you put it back in the data?
We have left it file-based so far. And that's just to make sure that if there are any changes from the team that's working on the site, we can track them and push them into the database and sort of develop based off of those if we need to. The plan is to sort of wean them off of that, but I like the ability to have that file config available so that if we do have to turn around and make changes, we can just export that config, import it back in the local machine, and basically have the same site without having to pull the entire database.
We've got one we've got on file-based, and we're about to convert it to database-based. And we're running into some.
Yeah. So by default, config is stored in database on D8. You actually have to turn on the file-based config. Not a huge deal, but is sort of strange if you've never had to do it before. I had to research like 3 or 4 different articles to make it happen, and I wish I had linked them now that I say that. But moving to file-based config management is more stable, it's more consistent, cuts down on features like I mentioned. It's easy to do with Drush. All you have to do is know 2 commands, Drush sim, CIM, and Drush sex, CEX, for configuration import, configuration export. Basically, it takes all of your configuration on the site, exports it to your files, or imports it to your files, depending on the command that you run. There are, and I cannot remember if this is in core or not, I don't think it is, but there's a configuration management module that will allow you to see any conflicts before you do any of your import or export. So if there are changes that you don't necessarily approve or are superfluous, then you don't have to actually hold on to those. File-based configuration management, though, super, super useful and is absolutely part of our dev workflow moving forward.
Okay, so you're using the Drush import and export commands.
Mm-hmm.
We actually converted it and we're storing the active configuration as file-based.
Oh, it's 100% the active configuration? That was... See, that's the thing. Originally, we thought that was going to be part of Drupal 8 core, and that's how they pushed it, moving forward. And we were very excited about it. Seemed like a very interesting step because, Drupal was so database-based, but I did not realize that they were still allowing that.
You have to insert there's some configuration you put in settings.php and you have to set up a service for it.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, you can do that. But we've run into some issues where it's not, there's still components that are left in the database.
Yeah.
So it gets fragmented. And so we wound up in the late stages of the game when we had the client pre-staging content, having to start doing database swaps.
Oh, wow. Does the is it still caching the database in the, or is it still caching the configuration in the database at all, or is that just okay?
It's 100% file-based right now.
That's beautiful, actually. That was one of the big promises of Drupal 8.
Version control, but the thing that's missing is that there are still some fragmented components that are still in the database.
Yeah.
And so having it in two different places is actually causing us quite a few.
And that was one of the big concerns I had when I found out that they weren't doing 100% all the time file-based anymore, was that, if you've got your config stored in two different places and a whole litany of people that are building these third-party modules, then how do they know exactly where the configuration is? Because some people like to get into the nitty-gritty when they make changes to their own modules. But it sounds like that's kind of what you're running into. All right. Good to know moving forward.
We're actually going to the model that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. I feel like that's given the concerns that you've just expressed, and knowing that database only configuration is really rough in a development environment. I think having that configuration exported and imported again is probably one of the best ways to do it, and actually very easy if you have the command line tools in place already to put in your continuous integration if you're doing stuff like that. Module difficulties. This is the part I love every year, because every year I kind of come to this camp with a different project that we wrapped up recently, and I get to complain. So, yay, complaints. Media embedding. I told you I'd get back to it. This basically works by having a shortcode in the content that is rendered through filter as a media entity. Very clever. And I like the concept. It does a good job also of rendering this content in the CK editor. So if you drop in place an image through media embedding, then you'll see it in the editor, you'll see it in the output. Everything's hunky-dory, right? It's a lovely idea, but it's missing some key elements. There's no way to style that media entity at all. Short of putting a wrapper around it, there's nothing you can do to actually say, hey, I want this image centered, which is not useful for anybody. Well, I take that back. It's probably very useful for a lot of people, depending on the entities that you're trying to the media that you're trying to put in place. But for things like images and videos that actually have to be defined as to where they're going on the site, that's not very useful. Resizing, also out of the question. So if you have giant images scaled for 2 times retina display or something like that, it's not going to work for you. Oh, sorry. Check and see how I'm doing on time here. The biggest issue we ran into, though, was that the modal breaks on subsequent uses. And what I mean by that is when you use a modal, when media embedding uses a modal to input content on the page, so you could do it on the initial load of the page just fine, but once you save it and then go back in to edit it again, it won't load the modal. You'll just get this lovely little loading bar across the bottom. As far as we can tell, the issue is actually a problem with the Bootstrap theme that we used as the parent theme for the site, but it's a conflict in how modals are actually being done across Drupal. But it's not just a problem with media embedding. I've seen this issue crop up in core. I don't know particularly the solution yet, so we kind of had to step back and ultimately abandon media embedding 100%. But that's not the only reason. Like I said, the styling, a big problem for anybody that's actually editing content. Another module we had issues with, Page Manager. If you've ever had to use, or I say had to, if you've ever used panels in Page Manager, lets you do lovely page layouts. You can sort of set them up the way you would set up blocks, in that You could configure a page to display a certain way by path or by permission. It's okay as a way of doing page layouts. It implements the new Layout Manager API. I don't believe that's core. I think that's been sort of popped out into its own thing. They wanted it in core very badly, but it just didn't fit the definition of what core needed to be, so it's its own little API module. The issue that we had was moving from Alpha 23 to Alpha 24, and like I said, it's in Drupal 8, a lot of this ecosystem is still very young, but they're working on it, I promise. But we moved from Alpha 23 to Alpha 24, and it completely broke the entire page manager setup. I've seen some updates to supporting modules for this that have come out and may have helped the situation, but we've really only got this in place to manage the layout on the homepage, so it's not really worth it to invest so much time trying to fix an issue that can be solved by not updating a module. This actually may be representative of the same modal issue that's happening with media embedding, because I think Page Manager Alpha 24 moved to using modals to sort of lay out blocks and things like that. Field collections. Who in here has ever needed repeating fields? I'm sure you've used field group. I'm sure you've used field collection, paragraphs. We chose at the beginning of this project to use field collections. It seemed like the most out of beta sort of implementation, and it seemed like it had a lot of community support at the time. We basically just needed repeating groups of fields. We tried field group first, but if you've ever used field group, then you know that you can't have empty fields without a bunch of issues with the deltas not working correctly. So that was out. Field collections, we ultimately discovered, are not properly translatable. So if you're doing a multilingual site, field collections is not the way to go. We replaced it with paragraphs, which is probably the most robust solution out there. There's actually, and that's the ticket that I've linked at the bottom there, a push from Damien McKenna to go ahead and get rid of field collections and make paragraphs the primary way to have repeating groups of fields on a site, which I agree with, actually, now that I've had the issue. Yes?
I mean, another presentation earlier also mentioned paragraph, and they said pretty much the same thing. Don't use field collection, use paragraph. Yeah. My question is, paragraphs, at least the name suggests, seems to be about laying out content, but apparently it's not.
Yeah, it's kind of a misnamed module in my opinion, and that kept me away from using it for a very long time actually, because I had the same concern as you. I'm like, I don't need paragraph level content descriptions, but really, if you just think of it as a way to do field groupings, and field collections and paragraphs both have this, but also consider that paragraphs lets you change what type of field grouping you can put in place. It actually becomes a very robust tool for bringing a lot of just separate content together in a single place that you can reuse over and over. So, go ahead.
So it looks like field collection, as I know, it creates entities that are somehow linked to the node. Mm-hmm. While paragraphs, does it simply keep them as standard field API fields and then just group them somehow?
No. The way you said paragraphs might work is actually more how field groups works. It actually takes the separate fields, puts them together in a group, and then groups them by delta. So the 0 delta will all be the same line, 1 delta will all be the same line. That's why it kind of creates those issues. Paragraphs actually does an entity in the background as well. It's just a little bit more robust implementation as to how it does it, so it can do things like translations without sort of guessing as to what content needs to be rendered at what time. So I think they're, by and large, paragraphs and field collections are by and large about the same thing. It's just paragraphs is a little bit more mature, I think.
We used multi-value entity references for that.
Yeah, and I think paragraphs is actually based off of that, or at least has it as a requirement or something like that.
A lot of people find that paragraphs is 1,000 times easier to paint than field collections. To me, I thought it was. You end up looping through a bunch of crap in field collections.
Yeah, I ended up having very similar issues with those on Drupal 8, but it's not bad either side. It's just you kind of have to know how to access that data. That's an issue I've been having with Twig all over the place, though. Depending on the field type, it can be a little difficult to drill down into exactly the part of the field that has the data that you want. And paragraphs and field collections kind of have the same issue there. Module difficulties, the link module. And I know what you're saying. Wait, that's a core module. But we had a huge issue with this, and it's an ongoing issue. I've linked to the issue on the queue. I just saw a new patch today that I have not yet been able to try out yet, but it's a big problem. Because after we launched the site, we got reports that certain pages were 404ing. In a very strange way, because on the back end of the site, the page existed. You could go to the edit page, no problem. It was only when you went to a specific URL that the page itself 404'd. And it turns out, after probably weeks of research, we figured out that it was the link module that was actually causing it, which was a huge surprise. It's an issue with how it handles multilingual links. You can avoid it by making the link field translatable. If it's not translatable, then it'll try to reuse the same link for the English version as well as any foreign language version, and that's where it kind of breaks the URL caching. It's very complex and a terrible pain, and people are still working on it, and hopefully it'll be fixed soon. But sometimes you can't even trust the core modules, which is a lovely thing to find out about Drupal 8. Module difficulties, Biblio. Has anybody in here heard of Biblio or used Biblio in the past? It is a module that is essentially designed to take a piece of content and break it down into APA style or Chicago style listing of bibliographical information. It works wonders on sites that have need of citations. You can have a big list of citations. You could stick them into the content, like with footnotes. Very handy, very powerful. Also very much not in Drupal 8 yet. It's a vital part of the module architecture for educational sites. We basically can't build an educational site that has references without it. And it's not making any progress towards a Drupal 8 release at all. There's been a ticket outstanding for quite a long time. It's a little bit frustrating, but there is another module that's sort of coming up to pick up the slack called the Bibliography and Citation module, BibSite. I've tried it out in trying to get these sort of citations on the site, and it's still very young. But it is actually making progress. It's under active development, and I actually see that actually coming into its own eventually. But right now, because of this, Drupal 8's not a great place for sites that need citation. That being said, we do have a lot of citations on the site, and we ended up just using footnotes. Let me see if I can actually pull up a page here. Try clicking a little harder this time. Actually, I think clinical trials. Yeah, you can see here footnote if you've never had the opportunity to use that before. Another excellent module. It's basically a content filter that takes footnotes that are in the page and throws them all at the bottom of the page. You can click links to go back up to where that content appears, and then you can click those links to go back to the footnote at the bottom. This was essentially how we replaced the Biblio module on this site. It's unfortunate because we did kind of while we were working on the site, we actually talked to the client. We're like, oh, this module will be great. Biblio is an excellent resource. We're really looking forward to getting it on the site. It should be ready anytime, and it never happened. So that was a bit of a disappointment. But like I said, Bib site's moving forward. Hopefully that'll be robust enough in the next couple months to really provide a good alternative. So takeaways from the development of CancerQuest. Drupal 8 core is an absolute beast. It's a powerhouse. It's everything I want a Drupal 7 to be, plus more entities, which is always great. Configuration by file, eases development. Definitely use it if you haven't already. Multilingual is much easier than Drupal 7, but still very complex. And a lot of little tidbits of things you have to watch out for. And the module ecosystem is complete for Drupal 8. You can get everything you want to get done, but it's still pretty young. You're going to run into bugs, you're going to run into issues. People are working on them, but they're going to happen. Questions? Yes?
How many contrib modules did you wind up using?
Ooh, since Drupal 6, I make it a habit not to count. I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 25, maybe even 35. Yeah.
We did a site similar to this for HIV trials prevention, or HIV prevention trials network out of Durham, and we used 8.
Oh, wow.
Total. We were able to build the entire site with some pretty complex functionality, with 8 modules and then some custom code.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the modules that we had just came from people trying to make modules on Drupal 8 a little bit more compartmentalized. Like I said, media became, this dozen or so modules, and then migration went from just a migration module to, 4 or 5 different modules. I think it's really just a movement towards, you only need a little bit of code for this, so we'll just give you a little bit of code.
And we're implementing some media management stuff on it now. So.
Cool.
For the translation management tool, you mentioned that it kind of builds a shopping cart of I'd like to translate these items. Can you go into a little more depth about that? Does it produce a CSV, and how does that all work? No,
it's all actually in the site. Basically, the shopping cart functionality isn't something I've actually had a lot of experience with. What the workflow is on this side is really translators will come in and make accounts and then be able to access through different parts. But the translation management would be more powerful for users that were looking for external translation services. I don't know a whole lot about how the shopping cart works. I do know that it would let you add translations to that cart and then sort of send that out to those services to obtain kind of a quote.
So it sounds like Drupal 8 is still not mature and has a lot of nuances when it comes to modules and things like that. So why did you decide to go with 8 instead of 7, which is mature already and has all this stuff?
Part of it was a desire to sort of try out new things. That's undeniable. I mean, best new thing, we want to check it out. Part of it was that we knew it was a little bit immature, and we thought that trying to build based off of it would allow us to do contrib back to the community. The reason we went to it for this site in particular is because a lot of it had to do with multilingual, actually, because it was one of the core focuses of Drupal 8 moving from Drupal 7. That was very important to Greg, the site owner, and it was very important to the Drupal community, and it's actually very well done. So that was sort of one of the overriding concerns. Trying to think if there's any others that jump to mind, but we knew it was sort of still in its infancy when we moved in, but that was kind of the point, basically.
So have you learned, is Drupal 8 performance better once you guys have everything finished, or?
We haven't done a lot of reporting on that. I will say that it's unfortunately markedly slower than the old Perk site, but the reason for that is because Perk actually pre-rendered all the pages. We have seen performance improvements using things like BigPipe, which is still under development for Drupal core, but part of Drupal core. and that's sort of over Drupal 7 sites. It's not really even a performance game. It's a perceived performance game that sort of loads elements of the site without actually. It loads the important things first, basically. It gets the CSS, the images, things like that, before the rest of the content. Yeah. But performance-wise, it's, and I think most of the research out there will back this up, it's a little bit slower than Drupal 7. And honestly, we'd like to see improvement there, but I think it's something they're actively working on.
Are you using any caching?
Yeah, we are using pretty robust caching, which, if you've ever dealt with caching before, will get you into a little bit of trouble, but we've ironed out most of the kinks for that. So,
are you using Varnish? Or?
I don't know what we're using on the service. I think it's Varnish, but I'm not 100% on that.
So you think Drupal 8 help with SEO better than 7?
BigPipe does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's really just a matter of how it's delivering the content, not necessarily what content it's delivering with BigPipe.
Basically, when Google crawls the site and you've got BigPipe enabled, your time to first byte is drastically reduced, and so it helps you.
Okay, so it's a low speed.
Yeah.
Improvement. Gotcha.
You had one in the back?
I was just going to say about the translation management stuff. I've used it on Drupal 7 and other stuff. And what it does with the cart option, it basically creates I forget exactly the extension, but it's an industry standard extension. So the people that we were working with, we would just send them the file, and it would come back to us in the same format. It's an XML of some sort, and it just feeds right back in and it gets the translation.
Yeah, the reason it came off as such as an impressive tool is because it seems so seamlessly integrated with all those outside translation sources. Oh no. All right, any other questions? All right, well then thank you guys for showing up. I appreciate it. There are refreshments outside.